There was a huge amount of publicity surrounding the film because the novel was unbelievably popular.
If you would go back to that year, it was Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Antonio Banderas, Stephen Ray, Christian Slater, all in one big movie at the same time.
I was very proud of the movie, and I thought Neil Jordan did an extraordinary job with the film.
I was just blown away. I couldn't believe the fidelity to the book and the beauty of the film, the costume design, the art direction, the cinematography. I thought it was just stunning.
Rice's vampires are so appealing because she really opens up all sorts of new possibilities.
Anne Rice changed the landscape of vampires for all time. There will never be anybody that changes them as much as Anne Rice did.
In virtually every ancient culture, we have a myth or a legend involving a blood-drinking demon.
The vampire, since its rise in the late 18th century, has been a figure that embodies the cultural anxieties and hopes in many ways. It's an essential figure of counterculture, through the ages. Each historical period and each age actually embodies certain types of its own fears and hopes and anxieties in the vampire.
It begins with Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, Christabel, which is the first vampire poem in English. And most of the vampire figures that follow in literature, until we get to Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, pretty much follow in the model created by Bram Stoker in Dracula.
So the vampire literature mirrors human nature, I think, really after Rice in a new way, because she allows us into the head of the vampire. So you can see the struggle between good and evil.
I thought, what would it be like to interview a vampire? He begins to answer the questions of an interviewer. What's the story going to be? What kind of a life can a vampire live? What sort of tragedy might have occurred in his own life? How did he get along with other vampires?
Shall we begin when I was born to darkness, as I call it?
Anne Rice is, like Stephen King, is somebody who recreated American popular kind of Gothic fiction, made it into something rich and strange and dark and extraordinary.
I was Louis, and I was telling the story of what it was like to be made a vampire, and I was telling all about my feelings and resentments and anger, and it just developed.
The novel began in part because of her own sense of alienation, what she described as a kind of post-war malaise that was part of the environment at her college when she was a student, and that she wanted to write about an alienated being, a sense of what it was to be alienated in this world without God.
She wanted a character that represented the outsider, and the perfect outsider was the vampire. And so if you pick a character that looks like us and seems like us, it can represent so much more and can be so much more accessible.
She'd made the entire idea of the world of vampires and the world of the undead relate to something that was actually very basic in human beings.
I think everybody has come to realize that the vampire is an incredible metaphor for the outsider in all of us and the outcast in all of us.
We belong in hell. And what if there is no hell? But they don't want us there. Ever think of that?
The book and the movie, they probed the whole idea of vampirism to a depth that had never been experienced before.
All I knew was that I was taking this popular icon, this kind of late show figure, and I was doing my own version.
The 18th and 19th centuries were the perfect time for this story to be set, because this is a time of great transition. It's a time of great transition in Europe. It's a time of perfect transition in the United States. It's the birth of the United States. And as we see in the movie, it's a time where hundreds of thousands of people are just coming to this country to start new. Lestat's a rock star. He's a guy that is neither good nor bad, right? He just lies upon that line of goodness and evil.
What makes the character so great, why I keep coming back to him in book after book, is that he's good and bad. I mean, really good and really bad. Capable of doing horrible things just to see what would happen, like he makes Claudia, a little girl, into a vampire just to see what will happen.
You fiend. One happy family.
I would describe him as any celebrity, a man that's more in love with himself than the world's in love with him. He's beautiful, but not in a masculine way, in a way that's almost perfectly feminine.
Lestat wasn't even a concern of mine when I wrote Interview with the Vampire. I was Louis, and it was Louis' story. Lestat was loosely based on my husband. Physically, the description of him was exactly the way my husband appeared at that time. Long blonde hair, feline grace, confidence. He was one of those characters who just grew in the corner of my eye. I didn't have to do anything conscious with Lestat. That character just took off in blazing color. You know, he'd come charging into the room and the dialogue would pick up and the excitement, and I'd have more to write.
Oh, yes. This calls for a celebration.
He seduces men, he seduces women. I don't think he shows a preference for either one. When he kills, he prefers a young man.
From the get-go, my characters have been polymorphous. Sexuality is their thing. They're omnisexual. They'll sleep with a man, a woman, a child. They see everybody as beautiful and seductive and attractive. So I guess what I wanted for the movie was get that lovable quality in there. You know, they're bad guys, and they do terrible things. But get that, you know, make the audience love them in spite of their evil, in spite of their destructiveness. Get the audience to just totally love them. Get the audience to want to be bitten on the neck.
Now try something on a more subtle note.
Because they were once human and share so many human traits, we are able to explore human emotions, human experiences through them in this kind of parallel.
To me, she was a child, but to Lestat, a pupil.
One of the interesting things about this question, what is a vampire, is the way that Rice doesn't give this away immediately.
He's angry and confused and goes out in the world to find out if there are other vampires and who they are and what he is, and he goes on a search for the oldest in the world. Well, that, again, this doesn't come out to the second book. In the movie Interview with the Vampire, he's already learned a lot of things that he can't tell Louis and Claudia, and that's part of his tragedy too. He can't really answer their questions because he's been bound to secrecy by those who told him the history of the tribe.
But you must know something about the meaning of it all.
Why should I know these things? Do you know them?
People don't do things to be evil. They don't, you know, they do things because they think they're right. And they think what they're doing is right. And it just so happens that it can be evil to others. So it was really important to understand that and understand Lestat's loneliness.
He's a man that understands that the world is a cruel place. And as a result, he sees himself as better than everybody around him. But he doesn't really understand himself. So he's performing what he believes a man should be. He's performing what he believes a vampire should be.
They're exploring major questions about identity, about the nature of good and evil, and that these characters are searching for those answers.
I want to be her. Hannah, Louis, be like her one day?
He really does love Louis. He really does love Claudia. And he does feel that what he's giving them is this wonderful gift of eternal life.
And his tragedy in the book is that they don't realize that, really. They're so afraid of him and so in awe of his power that they don't for a moment really try to empathize with him or see things from his point of view. He becomes a villain to them.
I would describe him as like a snake, right? So he's very charming and he can pull you in and you can't look away from him. He can read your mind. He can tell whether you're good or evil. And that allows him then to make the decision whether or not he should feed on you. Note that he tends to feed on the good, not the evil, because he thinks good people taste better.
He's angry about the life that he knew previously. He's angry about the life that he has lost. And he takes out his anger on his victims.
I had feelings about him as I wrote the first book, that he had once been a very good boy and had been deeply, brutally disappointed in life, and I let a little of that come into the text. But again, I always follow this instinct with characters. I expect them to come to life. The book doesn't get written if they don't, and they surprise me.
Well, the interesting thing about Lestat to me is that he seems to love evil.
My friend should taste those lips.
Lestat's paradox is that he knows he's evil, but he can fool people into believing he's not. And he's very aware of that. And even when he tries to show people how bad he is, they generally love it.
There's still life in the old lady yet!
When I was making the film, I used to watch whatever nature films I could find on mainly feline animals. They wouldn't want to kill the thing immediately. They would play with it. They would let it run. They would let it think it could escape. They'd jump in it again. They'd wound it a little bit, watch it run off again and jump at it. And that, to me, kind of is Lestat. His saving grace is that every now and then he can be funny.
Now, who will we get to finish your dress? There's a practicality, shall we? Remember, in our home.
Tom Cruise did a marvelous job of playing Lestat. He got the incredible strength of Lestat. He got the sense of humor of Lestat. He got the boldness of Lestat.
I always thought it'd be wonderful to have, you know, to show Lestat's sense of humor, because he is such a bright character. I mean, you live that long, you've read every book, you know, you can play any instrument you wish to play.
One of my favorite moments is the time when they're in the hotel and they're with the two women.
And in that scene, Tom Cruise is really Lestat. The anger, the boiling resentments that he can't really express.
Kill them swiftly if you will, but do it! For do not doubt, you are a killer, Louis!
It's hard to pick out moments because they were all pretty good. I mean, I can't think of a moment where he didn't get it.
As an actor, it's very challenging because you have to really root this character in an emotional reality so that you're not caught playing attitudes.
In Anne Rice's novel, we have for the very first time a vampire, namely Louis, who is this very sensitive vampire, this very emotional vampire who doesn't yet really understand his own nature and is having tremendous difficulty accepting it.
I wanted him to be experiencing doubts. The same kind of doubts we have. He becomes a vampire, but nothing's really answered for him. Is there a God? Is there a devil? Is he going to go to hell? Is he demonic? Or is he just some sort of mutant?
Louis to Lestat is his son, his lover, the man that he hoped he could create, the perfect partner. He disappoints him almost immediately.
Whiny coward of a vampire who prowls the night killing rats and poodles. You could have finished us both. You condemn me to hell. I don't know any hell.
I always felt strongly that Lestat totally loved Louis, that he loved his pain and his suffering and his vulnerability and his sensitivity, and he wanted to take care of Louis and protect him, and he desperately wanted to be loved by Louis. He wanted to be loved by that kind of man.
It makes sense that he would pick a man that's both thinking, that's beautiful, that can do what he thinks would make him the perfect companion.
Lestat is sometimes associated with the 18th century, with the Age of Enlightenment, and in the novels, Louis is noted by Armand, another vampire, as the spirit of his age, the 19th century.
Louis is a romantic. He's a brooding, provincial romantic.
Forgive me if I have a lingering respect for life.
He's really what later becomes the 19th century romantic hero.
Louis is a New World vampire. He is a true American vampire.
Louis is a vampire with a conscience, sadly. You know, he's a vampire who cries every time he kills.
And this makes him appreciate mortality in a way that he never had before.
Louis is very much an externalizer. He's constantly concerned with how the world sees him and how he thinks the world sees him.
The character was very sympathetic. The fans really thought that was Louis, and they felt Louis's pain. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to feel that, and they wanted to know that, and they wanted an actor who would give them that. And Brad Pitt did a wonderful job. He's a very beautiful, beautiful guy.
The film is full of thing that I recognize, which is this kind of Catholic guilt, you know, this guilt about death and sin, and You know, the kind of loss of certain kind of paradise and the fact that living on Earth is a kind of a reenactment of some kind of primal crime.
Most vampire fiction does have elements of religion in it, from crucifixes to holy water, to praying, to including a priest or some sort of exorcist.
Early vampire fiction almost always had a religious component to it. And it had a religious component to it because in certain respects, the vampire is a kind of mirror image of some of the things that we associate with the concept of God or the concept of Jesus.
There's a religious element in Interview with the Vampire and in all the Vampire Chronicles, but the religious element is not certainty. It's people questing and asking and pointing out ambiguities and problems and never being able to find a concrete answer. There are no religious givens as in old vampire fiction.
Your fall from grace has been the fall of a century.
Vampire fiction is really obsessed with religious symbols and oftentimes inverts them. And that really comes in the 18th century, in the age of the Enlightenment, just at the moment where the religious outlook on the world is being gradually replaced by the scientific one. The belief in vampires sort of comes striking back.
There is God, and the way that he describes God and the devil, which is so beautifully done by Anne Rice, is that the devil comes from God. And so all the powers of the devil come from God. And as a result, the devil, therefore, can be no more evil than man. And vampires, therefore, are not evil, because we all come from God.
Evil is a point of view. God kills indiscriminately. And so shall we. For no creatures under God are as we are, none so like him as ourselves.
He's an atheist. He doesn't believe in God. He has a secular mentality that was very typical, I think, of a European gentleman in the 18th century.
Vampires are somewhere between God, the angels, and man. So he sees himself as something greater than man. Louis sees being a vampire as the epitome of evil.
What is interesting is the representation of the vampire that is totally not afraid of crucifixes, that the only thing that is their enemy is the light.
How about the old stake through the heart thing? Nonsense. Coffins. How about coffins?
Coffins. Coffins, unfortunately, are a necessity.
I decided early on that Louis wasn't going to have anything to fear from crosses or garlic. That was too magical.
We move into a more secular age. The belief that any of those talismans have any kind of impact on a supernatural creature, they begin to disappear.
Before Interview with a Vampire, vampires were primarily depicted as monsters. And that was really because the vampire was always told from the voice of the human, so that the outsider's voice was never heard.
I don't know why I took the perspective of the vampire initially, except I thought it was interesting. And I did go to the library halfway through to make sure nobody else had already done it. Nobody else had written a novel in the first person from the vampire. It certainly was what I wanted to do. I really wanted to get his side of it. He was the interesting one to me, not the victims. I wanted to hear how he felt about being a vampire. That was the whole idea. What would he say if we interviewed him? What would he reveal?
Rice's novels are much more interested in philosophical issues, issues of good and evil. Her characters ponder things more and more deeply than, say, in the Southern Vampire Mysteries.
Charlaine Harris brought just incredibly funny, witty, clever ideas to the idea of contemporary vampires being able to buy artificial blood in bottles and hang around in the town of Bonton. She just took it in all kinds of wonderful directions.
And now they are sexy, they are attractive, they are as much like human beings as human beings.
I think the concept is so rich that once it got out there in the culture and people started to be interested in it again, it was inevitable that people would do all kinds of wonderful things with it. Stephanie Meyer would take it and put vampires in high school in Forks, Washington, and create a romantic vision that would make millions of teenagers very, very happy.
Vampire culture in the last 20 years, it's helped by the internet. Right? It's helped by the fact that we have access to everything that we want. Just like vampires consume blood, we can consume the vampire.
The vampire is a rich character. I mean, first of all, he's human and a monster. He can be very, very good looking and still be an absolutely lethal, deadly predator who can just destroy you and everybody around you. So that's very seductive right there. Also, he's a monster you can talk to.
There are vampires that can go out in sunlight. There are vampires that can give birth to children. There are vampires that are aliens. There are millions of vampires. There are vampires that sparkle in sunlight. There are all sorts of vampires, just like there are all sorts of humans.
And of course, how interesting to put him next to you in class in high school. You know, and have him fall in love with you.
The craze and the phenomenon with vampire and the vampire film is, I think, directly proportional to the way in which our culture is more and more accepting of violence and sexuality in everyday life and in the media.
The vampire and the vampire scenario has become a very interesting metaphor that gives people an opportunity to talk about a host of these difficulties.
The whole landscape has been changed. They've become parts of popular fiction in a way I could never have imagined. I mean, kids have little vampire dolls now. I don't fully understand it, I have to say, you know?
The question of why young girls are drawn to the dangerous vampire, the dangerous sexy vampire, is sort of the million-dollar question that a lot of parents would like to know.
So here you've got this monster, this articulate monster who can recite poetry, listen to classical music, waltz beautifully, and also bite your throat and suck every drop of blood out of you in a minute and throw your body over his shoulder.
Monsieur Vampire, take me! I adore you! You with your tongue!
Young girls have this wish for a fantasy figure, and a vampire is more intriguing than a knight in shining armor.
The enduring appeal of vampires is something to do with the death of religion. And I think that people want otherworldly creatures in their lives and in their imaginations. And I think they want stories that are about good and evil and about something beyond this life.
It's not simply a bad boy, but, you know, high school can be awful, and you can feel isolated and rejected. And wouldn't it be great if, instead of just the usual stuff that you have to deal with, there were mythical beings that were there instead?
They seem to love this romantic character, and this character who's condemned to darkness. And in a way, I think maybe they loved the fact that he was beyond sexuality.
Provides a way to talk about certain issues that are really hard to grapple with. Being an outsider, being an other, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender. These are all different ways of approaching some very sensitive topics.
Without diminishing the amazing work that all of these hundreds of authors have done, I think they've really taken Anne Rice's template. It's a rare vampire novel that you'll read that doesn't have these two characters in it.
This character has some kind of existence that is beyond the book. It's, you know, it's penetrated kind of the imagination of young kids in a way that was extraordinary.
They've taken the idea of the romantic vampire and they've built on it. They've turned him into a really sexualized hero.
Vampires will always come back because they have a story to tell. Vampire literature has been around for hundreds of years, and it's still going.
Anne Rice was an author that was able to make the vampire absolutely accessible, and was able to allow us to see this person as perhaps not just a predator, but as somebody that's a marginalized person. So anybody on the outside, and at some point in all of our lives we feel like we're on the outside.
It's quite a compliment to see people citing me as an influence on their vampire fiction. I'm very pleased, I'm very grateful, I'm really happy about it, and I am excited to see all that other people have done with the vampire concept.